Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I've Never Told You, a production by iHeartRadio.
And welcome to a very special crossover. Is that what we're going to call this, Anney?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to call it crossover. So, as you already know, if you've been listening, I was a guest on Margaret Killjoy's podcast called Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. And this last time that I was on there, I got to hear the history of the public library. And it was such a fascinating episode. I love these types of episodes. And I've talked about it a few times to the point that I think we've even talked about the native peoples in Puerto Rico. The Taino, which is what we talked about a little bit on the episode. So I asked if we could actually play this on our feed because I loved this episode so much, specifically part 2. And it is titled Pura Belpré, the Puerto Rican librarian who brought a bilingual storytelling to New York. So I really wanted y'all to be able to hear this. And you should also go back and listen to their first part of this episode because this is part 2. But please enjoy this crossover episode with myself and Margaret Killjoy talking about this amazing person, Pura Belpré.
Cool Zone Media.
Hello, and welcome to Cool People Did Cool Stuff, your weekly reminder that despite all the bad things that are happening, there's people who try to do things about the bad things that are happening. And I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy, and with me this week to talk about libraries is Samantha McVey. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on again. I love being a part of the show. Yay.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question. You're the host of Stuff Mom Never Told You.
Correct.
I don't know your relationship with your own mother. Does your mom ever get mad about the implication that she never told you these things?
So that's a loaded question.
That
you don't
is
have
a
time
very
for this.
loaded question.
This is a real loaded question.
Okay, fair
I'll tell
enough.
you this. When I told my mother I was quitting my social work job to become a podcaster, which, as you would expect, first thing was radio. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That was that. And then it went into, feminist show. Oh, no, you've become one of those people who is ruining the world. And that proceeded to a cry session and us ignoring each other for a while. Better yet, speaking of libraries, I actually, myself and my co-host, recently wrote a book based on our show, Intersectional Feminism, and I have completely hidden that from my mother in fear of her being angry with me.
Oh, shit. I'm sorry that I brought it up. Thank you for your honesty about it anyway.
Loaded questions. But I will say, because my mother is absolutely against those things, there's a lot that my mother did not tell me.
Yeah, so you have a lot of material for the show.
Yeah, so there you go.
Mine would be there's I think it's Reductress or something, has a meme or headline or whatever of parent just accidentally forgot to mention that health issue they've been struggling with for 40 years that runs in the family.
Yeah.
Just like, whoops, never brought that one up.
I can't add that to the trauma that I've endured because I'm adopted, so...
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
no.
Fair enough.
There's so many loaded things that we're talking about. I apologize for the trauma dumping.
Yeah, nope. Now I'm just going to, let me see if I can come up with another thing to accidentally bring up that I...
As you can see, I'm handling it well.
You did great.
Oh, yeah. Sophie is our producer. Hi, Sophie.
Hey. I was like, when you asked that question, I was like, oh, I know Samantha.
I was going to say, she knows. She knows a little bit about trauma. We kind of bonded over it.
I was like, listen.
Loaded questions. You can't come in with those types of questions as an intro. I love making an awkward presence.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna come up with some even worse ones later. That's my plan. Our audio engineer is Rory. Hi, Rory.
Hi, Rory.
Hello. Sorry about the trauma dumping on you too.
Our theme music was written for us by Unwoman. And the main subject this week is New York and probably the U.S.'s first Puerto Rican librarian. She was an Afro-Puerto Rican author and puppeteer and trilingual hero named Pura Belpré. And she is a fascinating subject. I couldn't find a biography on her, like a book-length biography on her, but there's a lot of academic papers, librarians. There's a lot of academic papers about her and a lot of pop articles about her. So I've put together the best that I can. Her name was the first one on the list that was given to me by a librarian at the conference this year. And yeah, I was going to do them all, but it looks like I'm doing Pura. And the rest I'll do it some other time. Pura Belpré was born on February 2nd. Normally you'd say what year someone was born after you say the date. Who fucking knows what year she was born? Sources will claim 1899, 1901, 1902, and 1903. She claimed 1903, so I'm going to go with that one. I will let her self-identify birth year. It's also almost like weird. Well, there's supporting documents claiming other years, so it's not just a like, we don't trust her or whatever, right? She was generally reasonably cagey about her time in Puerto Rico as a kid, and which, you know, whatever, like no one needs to talk about their childhood unless the host of a podcast brings it up rudely at the top of an episode. So like, she's not a public figure. She's a librarian, you know? A lot of what is known about her are educated guesses, but she was one of 5 kids who grew up in a loving and religious family, most likely Catholic, but she didn't seem to write or talk much about religion as best as I can tell. She also seems to have written or talked very little about being Black. We've talked about this before on this show, like on the episodes we did about the Young Lords, which is this Puerto Rican, I guess called sort of the Puerto Rican Black Panthers, and that's fair, but also they're peers. So it's like, well, then the Black Panthers are the Black Young Lords, whatever, you know?
Right.
Anyway, we talked about how Puerto Rican racial identity, at least historically, looks really different than race looks in the continental U.S. So it's like, makes a lot of sense that she identifies strongly as Puerto Rican, and that is mostly what she talked about. She later married a Black man and regularly lived in Black neighborhoods, but it seems that her identity was primarily Puerto Rican. What she did write and talk about was her connection to the legacy of Puerto Rican folklore. She wrote, quote, "I grew up in a home of storytellers, listening to stories which had been handed down by word of mouth for generations. As a child, I enjoyed telling many of these tales that I had heard. The characters became quite real to me. I remember during school recess that some of us would gather under the shade of the tamarind tree. There, we would take turns telling stories." The best guess that people make, it almost feels like ghoulish the way that people write biographies, where you're like trying to dredge up this stuff that people clearly just didn't really want to talk about, and there's no reason that anyone should really care about the real specific nitty gritty of the class upbringing of this, you know, person. But,
yeah,
you know, here we are. The best guess is that she was in a family that was sort of culturally middle class, but without money, right? Without much money. Her father was a building contractor who moved the family around a lot for work. And she grew up speaking Spanish, English, and French, and both of her parents were literate. Her older sister Elise taught in Puerto Rico for 10 years before moving to New York City. This is one of the earlier waves of Puerto Rican movement into the U.S. And again, if you want to hear way more about that, listen to our episodes about the Young Lords. Pura graduated high school in 1919, then started college at the University of Puerto Rico. But when Elise got married in 1920, the whole family traveled to New York City for the wedding. And Pura was like, yeah, fuck it, I'm staying in New York. And so she stayed in New York. And at first she got work as a seamstress, which was one of the main jobs available to Puerto Rican immigrants at the time. But then, in 1921, she was hired by the Public Library of New York. Which means I can introduce another hero of the episode, Ernestine Rose.
Ooh.
Never met anyone named Ernestine. One day I'm going to meet a trans woman named Ernestine, because trans women love to name ourselves like weird old-timey names, said Margaret.
Yeah.
And I definitely know some like Agathas and, you know, whatever.
Good name.
Haven't met a Gertrude yet, but it'll happen.
Oh, I hope so.
Ernestine Rose was named after Ernestine Rose, which made her hard to look up because there's a much more famous Ernestine Rose. The first Ernestine Rose was an abolitionist and suffragist who I don't know a ton about, but Wikipedia called her the first Jewish feminist, or rather, Wikipedia says that other people called her that. And who am I to argue with? I didn't read much about her.
We're gonna mark that. Okay.
I know, because it was like, you can only follow each rabbit hole like a couple steps, right? Ernestine Rose, the younger one, is like the already the side character. And then I was like, now I'm going to read about this. I'm like, wait a second. What am I doing? I have to record at some point.
You just chase after so many.
Yeah. How do you handle the like level of...
I have so many miniseries episodes because it ends up being like, I have a thought. And then that thought turns into, see, we did a whole religious trauma and I thought it might be 2-parter. It's 13 parts, all an hour long.
Amazing. I really want to listen to that one.
So it goes bad. I don't do well. With
How long ago? How far back?
It was last year. Last year. Beginning of this year, because we were talking about just overall the new anti-feminist movement and then talking about anti-abortion movements and how it is very much rooted into religious trauma and white supremacy. So it became a whole thing. And then we went down so many rabbit holes, but it's specific, honestly, to American Baptists and like that. We don't even talk much about Catholicism. Like that's how deep we went in without going there.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was a thing.
Yeah, okay, so the answer is that you would also now be doing a whole side episode about Ernestine Rose 1 and Ernestine Rose 2. I appreciate that.
You're doing better at controlling this and actually being really, really like following through.
Thanks.
As opposed to myself, who I'm like, I can definitely do this in 13 parts. Let's go. So you're doing great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So much discipline.
So our Ernestine that we're going to talk about, the librarian Ernestine, we're going to call her Ernestine Jr., even though she isn't related to Ernestine Sr., just because it was funny to me. Both of them seem cool as hell. Ernestine Jr. is this white lady who may or may not have been Jewish. She apparently claims she was Jewish, and then one historian I read disputes this, who graduated from library school in 1905, making her one of the first bona fide librarians in the United States of America. And she hit the ground running to try and make libraries cooler. By 1908, she was working hard to make sure that whatever library she was in was actually integrated into the ethnic community that it was part of. So that's like the big thing we're going to talk about, is integrating libraries into the communities that they're part of. Instead of being sort of, you know, a place that shows up and is like, everyone should think like these white people think. And at the beginning, this meant serving the Yiddish and Russian-speaking Jewish community that she worked in, which is probably the community we've talked about 1,000 times on this show, because that's where all the weird anarchists and communists from Russia were hanging out, because they were all Yiddish-speaking Jews in like the 1910s in New York City. And later, she moved to Harlem, to a Black and Jewish community, and immediately started hiring non-white people for the library, like Catherine Allen, a Black woman. She also organized the 1921 exhibition of, quote, Negro art at the library, which, according to author George Hutchinson, quote, marked the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance in the visual arts. She made shit happen. Then, also in 1921, she hired Pura Belpré because there was a sizable and growing Puerto Rican community in the neighborhood as well. She actually first tried to hire Elise, the sister who got married, but then Elise's husband told her she wasn't allowed to go get this job. It's like a throwaway line. Like most of the things you read are like, was offered to Elise, who was busy and couldn't do it. And then you read the like slightly more in-depth piece and is like, her husband told her she couldn't, so she didn't.
She wasn't allowed.
Yeah. Unlike Pura, who did not get married until she was 40, which is probably the better way to go about it in certain circumstances, like an incredibly patriarchal culture of the United States at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Pura was hired as the Hispanic assistant, working in both the adult and children's rooms of the library. Her passion was clearly the children's room. This was the 135th Street branch of the library in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. And soon the library was the center of that cultural renaissance, or was a center of that cultural renaissance. And I still haven't deep dived the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm not going to do it today, but we've touched on it a few times, like on our episodes about Ben Fletcher, the Black labor organizer from Philly. Also, my great-grandmother was like a white artist who knew a lot of the people in that scene, especially where it overlapped with like leftism more broadly. And so I really want to learn more about it at some point. But I didn't this time. Suffice it to say, Harlem was a cool as shit place in the 1920s where Black people did a ton of amazing cultural stuff. And the library was part of it. It was intentionally part of it. Because librarians didn't start off as magically known as a place where people could meet and do things. It seems like they were seen as white places for white stuff until all these people at the 135th Street branch changed that. They held talks by like Langston Hughes and a bunch of other folks. And one librarian later wrote about this time, quote, "If you are familiar with Harlem, you are aware of the fact that the streets are frequently made impassable by the many soapbox speakers and their enthusiastic audiences. It occurred to us that if people will listen to politics and patent medicines, then they will listen to education too, provided it is well presented to them. So we employed one of the most eloquent and most popular of these speakers and paid him to address large crowds at strategic corners on the streets of Harlem. Once a week, these people were urged to come to a meeting at the library. Some 2,000 people were reached each week. If out of these, 50 appeared at the library, we were confident that something worthwhile had been accomplished." And so they just, got people to come to the library. The other thing that I think is really important to take away from that is from the very beginning, soapboxing, which everyone understands is the podcasting of ye olde times, frequently mixed politics and patent medicines. Which brings us to the next segment of this show, the advertisers. And we're back. And so, this library developed the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints in 1925. Ernestine Rose also helped the first black woman get through library school, a woman named Nella Larson, who worked for a while at the 135th Street branch, but is much more famous for her place in literature as a writer of American modernism and is like the most important novelist of the Harlem Renaissance. And there are biographies about her, and so I'm like, nope, too much of a side character, can't, because one day probably topic of her own.
We love bonus episodes on our show, so you should do bonus episodes with this. Like this. I'm just saying.
I do 2 a week. I mean, I guess you do.
We do 5.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough.
You're doing great. Keep going.
I am so impressed that you also still have time to come on other people's shows. I'm honored.
For you and for Sophie, anytime, all the time.
Oh, thanks.
Yes. I love this show. I learned so much.
Yeah. The other thing that happened in 1925 is that Pura Belpré enrolled in library school. And soon she's going to become the first Puerto Rican librarian in New York City and probably the country. I really liked the source I read that was like, yeah, we know she's the first Puerto Rican librarian in New York City. And it's like in parentheses, it's like, which realistically probably means the country, but they know they can't say it because it's not, because I really appreciate that.
Verified.
Because everyone knows that listens to this. I'm an enemy of any time anyone says the first person who did something, because like, you can't prove it. Anyway, whatever. My brain works in a very specific way.
Oh, no, I'm with you. Like when we talk about first on anything, it's understanding that it has to do with who's writing the history, where the historical context come from, and who's also claiming what. So it's always asterisks because also they just may not be discovered. And that's okay because that's some amazing things when you get to discover new information.
Totally. And being the first isn't the only thing that matters, you know?
Exactly. I'm sure she was just excited to be able to share her knowledge and her love and her passion.
Yeah, and she does it. She does it so much.
Yeah.
She gets involved in writing folklore. She once said, quote, "One of my duties in the children's room was to read the fairy tale shelves. Thus the folklore of the world opened for me. As I shelved the books, I searched for some of the folk tales I had heard at home. There wasn't even one. A sudden feeling of loss rose within me." And so she's at library school, and she has this teacher, another librarian folklorist, a white woman named Mary Gold Davis. So during that class, she writes a children's book called Perez y Martina. This goes on to be published in 1932 as the first Spanish-language children's book published by a mainstream press in the United States. And it is a romance between a cockroach and a mouse. And she is very clear. This is not her story. She heard this from her grandmother. And it is a Puerto Rican story. Like I've only been able to track down some of her stuff, and it'll specifically say like a Puerto Rican story rather than like, it'll have her name as the author, but instead of saying like by Pura Belpré, it'll say like a Puerto Rican story. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's so interesting when you see people with the love for their heritage, because we've seen it more and more, thank goodness, with like the indigenous people bringing their own folklore or like any kind of storytelling to life, and they share it with people, and they make sure to write it because we know with the colonization, we know with all this stuff, white people trying to erase history, part of erasing that history is those lores and trying to make them disappear or trying to like make them evil. We know all about that. So having people who take the opportunity and time to write it down so that they can share it and be preserved is such a phenomenal thing to see. And being able to see their love for their heritage is even like, it just feels like I'm being honored, like I'm being privileged to see and hear about their culture. And I love that aspect. Folklore is so beautiful to me just because of that. When I started learning more about like Korean folklore, I was like, what? And you just feel this sense of connectedness to something that you may not have in so long or ever. So it's such something to do with like, we should definitely be honoring people like her for preserving such tales and traditions. I love that.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it's interesting because one of the things that I end up, I read a lot of like 19th century folk tales, or rather 19th century writing down of folk tales. And so a lot of the older ones, the first ones in English are often written by these sort of white interlopers or like white observers who are trying to be good. You know, it's like kind of all over the board. They're either like, check out this wacky thing that they believe in Japan. And other times they're like, I'm white and I've lived in Japan for 40 years and I've tried really hard to do this right. You know?
Yeah.
And it's like really interesting. But people actually writing from that culture, which is what we see more now, is you're more guaranteed to get the like actual love of that culture instead of like,
yes.
And it's funny too, because you'll still even see like, check out this weird thing the Ukrainians believe over there in weird land, you know, because the Ukrainians weren't white in the Victorian mind. Like, I mean, whatever.
Right.
They weren't.
Right.
It's complicated. But
it's complicated.
Yeah. But it's interesting they bring up this thing about writing these stories down, because it's what we're going to talk about next. Libraries had a problem. They were colonized as fuck, right? As like an institution. So the only real stories by the library's mind are the ones that are written down. So storytelling for storytelling hour had to come from a book. Western libraries didn't understand the idea of oral literacy yet, right? The idea that you can be aware of your culture through oral traditions. Pura Belpré broke that. She was the first person, probably, to appeal and win the right to tell stories that had never been written down during story time. Mary Gold Davis, her teacher, told her, tell your stories, but only tell the children that none of these stories have been written down, but maybe someday they will. It's like this like almost paternalistic, but it's still this like love where like, yeah, this is amazing, but one day there'll be real stories. But it's still like, it's still the pretty genuine, like Pura actually has she thought very highly of the white women librarians who sought her out and nurtured her career and helped her break into this white dominated field.
Right.
So she told the stories that eventually would find their way into another one of her books, The Tiger and the Rabbit, which was the first English language collection of Puerto Rican folklore in the US. And she starts writing. And her branch is doing amazing stuff in the Black community. And then in 1929, she transfers to the 115th Street branch in a Puerto Rican community. And it's here that she really hits her stride and starts kicking ass as a librarian. As far as I can tell, she pioneered Spanish language content in public libraries. I expect she did it as part of a team of people who are also amazing, right? But she worked her ass off to get the community involved in the library. At some point, she watched a puppet show at her branch and was like, oh, this is the shit. Puppets rule. I'm sure that's how she said it. And so for the rest of her life, she worked with kids to put on puppet shows, because that was part of it, was that by doing puppets, you could bring the kids into it.
All right.
And she went around to churches, to community centers, to neighborhood organizations and schools to put on shows and like just do outreach into community. She did bilingual shows regularly too, not just Spanish language shows. And this just like hadn't been done. She put on events for Three Kings Day, a Puerto Rican holiday. And she said this, quote, indirectly presented the library to this group in a way that no other activity could have done. Their confidence was gained. The library put on complete programs in Spanish for children and for adults. And basically, they did at the 115th branch what the 135th branch did for the Black community. And there's a downside to this. Although I've read conflicting tales of it, there's a problem if I actually look into too many sources as they all start arguing with each other, you know?
Right.
Okay, so this isn't the librarian's fault, but instead a racist city government's fault. Basically, these two libraries served as, quote, ghettos where all Black and Spanish language content could be put, where all Black and Latinx workers could be hired. So it was like, you try and get hired as a Black worker, and they'll be like, oh, we'll go up to 135th. And they're like, that's not where I live, you know? And they'll be like, oh, we already have a Black library. Like, we don't need another one.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a problem. And this limits their career advancement, right? Because you can only work in this one place.
Right. Instead of opening spots or opening doors, they're like, compete with each other. Here you go. Good luck. And this is because you need to fight this space. This small amount of space is all we have for you. But anyway, keep going. Yes.
So in 1939, the Puerto Rican community had moved a bit in the city. So she moved once again to East 110th Street and kept up all the same stuff. Bilingual story hour, reading clubs, puppet theater, you name it. But you know what they didn't have at these libraries? Ads, because they were tax funded instead of funded by private companies. But we, on the other hand, are funded by private companies. And that is just the compromises that everyone makes all the time. Like the following compromises. Here they are. And we're back. In 1940, she goes to the ALA, the American Librarian Association, convention in Cincinnati. And while she's there, she meets a musician and composer named Clarence Cameron White, who is, we're going to get to the first potential drama that I'm entirely inferring. The way that this story is presented is that she meets him and then they get married a couple years later and everything's happy and great. And I started writing it by reading about him and being like, oh, he was recently widowed or widowered or whatever. He'd recently lost his wife. The complication, she meets him in 1940. His wife doesn't die until 1942 and they don't get married till 1943. What happened?
Oh, drama.
Probably they were just friends and then, yeah.
Were they? Can they be friends?
Yeah, I mean, can they? Yeah, man and a woman doesn't seem possible. But a figure like this, every version of her history is going to be a little bit sanitized. I mean, I found no scandal. I'm not particularly worried that there's some crazy skeleton in her closet. But it's when you're talking about a children's puppeteer person, no one's trying to write about anything salacious, you know?
Being the other woman. Though, her personality, everything about her, it reminds me of someone like my old drama teacher who is so passionate and so they perform and they love and they tell stories and they understand the importance of puppetry, in bringing in acting out these different characters. I could only imagine what kind of performances she gave in her storytelling and with that, what type of passion she has in just in her imagination, being able to relay these stories in a way that she was so successful enough to be known to do this, as well as writing these stories. I just imagine she's just one of those people.
No, totally.
That you can't help but notice anyway.
Yeah.
And then the effort she puts in telling these stories, it's not telling a story. It is living that story for the children or with the children. And I can only imagine that's kind of how she also lived life.
I believe it.
So who knows? Maybe some drama does happen because when you have that much passion, Yeah. It makes her interesting.
No, I believe it. And it's interesting, right? Because you're talking about someone who never had children and gets married at 40, right? And so you're...
my type of woman.
You're talking about someone who either lived the cat lady life or lived a pretty wild life, you know?
And we exist to not have either of those things, Margaret. How dare you? True. You're with us. What are you talking about?
It's true, right? As an unmarried person in her 40s.
No children.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also, and the reason I mentioned my great-grandmother, who's basically living in New York around the same time as an artist, also didn't get married until 40, and then had one child.
They knew what's up.
And that's wasn't normal at all for someone living, a woman living in the early part of the 20th century.
Right.
So she falls in love with Clarence White. He's got his own Wikipedia page as a composer and was one of the most prominent violinists in the country. And after they get married, Pura takes a leave of absence from the library to follow him around on tour for a bit. And then she goes back to the library. And then she's like, you know what? I actually want to focus on my writing. And so she just kind of wants to be doing the art stuff. And hell yeah. And so she does that for a while. She writes, as far as I can tell, she keeps up the storytelling and the puppets during this time, but I'm not 100% certain, but it's like implied. And she writes like 8 books. 17 years into married life, her husband dies of larynx cancer in 1960. Mm-hmm. She goes back to the library to a new post, one that I think they might have made just for her, the Spanish children's specialist. And so at this point, that whole thing about like the Spanish language stuff only being at 1 or 2 branches is not the case. That was actually some of the stuff that there seemed to be drama about. Is like, I read some people arguing that sort of ghettoization was not as prominent as other people were claiming, and that it was other issues keeping people from advancing. And I read a lot of drama about employment discrimination in the 1930s, basically. Anyway, at this point, Spanish language stuff all over wherever it's needed. And so she just goes to every branch where it's needed and helps plan events and helps bilingualize the New York City public library system, which is, if that's all she had done, it would have been amazing.
That's huge.
If all she had done was write those children's stories, it would have been amazing. If all she'd done was be a puppeteer, would have been amazing. Mm-hmm. Then, when she was 65, she was forced to retire because all city employees at the time were forced to retire at 65. I don't know if that's still the case or not. I actually wonder, because at the top I was saying that there's like all these documents suggest she was not born in 1903, but she told people she was born in 1903, you know? I wonder if it was so that she could keep working a couple extra years.
Smart.
But I'm not sure. You know, that's entirely my conjecture. She died in 1982, but her legacy continues to this day. Starting in 1996, the American Library Organization gives out an award in Belpré's name every year for children's books by Latino authors. A librarian originally from the Dominican Republic named Vianela Rivas told NPR in 2016, quote, "Because of her, we have a story time in Spanish. We have computer classes in Spanish. And I feel like as a Latina librarian, we have a responsibility to continue doing the work that she started." Shockingly, her books are out of print right now, despite her being the earliest known Afro-Caribbean American writer, despite there being an award in her name. And yeah, there are still 3 more librarians on that list of cool librarians that I was handed, so expect to be returning to this subject. But I wanted to read some of her stories on Book Club, but I haven't found a PDF of it yet. The Internet Archive had one, but they're hacked right now. I found one really short story, and so fuck it, I'm going to read it to you all now.
Do you have a puppet?
I'll pretend to have a puppet. Yeah,
I want the full experience.
You all should act as though I have a really amazing puppet.
Okay.
It's actually interesting that you talked about, when you were talking about folklore earlier, and we were talking about how like indigenous folklore is perceived by others, right? Mm-hmm. This story is going to use the word Indian to describe the people that's talking about, right? And it's going to be describing indigenous people. Mm-hmm. But the North American conception of race isn't necessarily going to apply one-to-one to in a Puerto Rican context. And like, so it's like interesting because I can't say as cleanly how it relates to indigenous culture, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, that's my way of saying if the story had been written by a white person, I would be suspect of it, but it was not.
Gotcha.
The Legend of the Hummingbird from Puerto Rico by Pura Belpré. Between the towns of Cayey and Sidra, far up in the hills, there was once a small pool fed by a waterfall that tumbled down the side of the mountain. The pool was surrounded by pomarosa trees, and the Indians used to call it Pomarosa Pool. It was the favorite place of Alida, the daughter of an Indian chief, a man of power and wealth among the people of the hills. One day, when Alida had come to the pool to rest after a long walk, a young Indian came there to pick some fruit from the trees. Alida was surprised, for he was not of her tribe. Yet he said he was no stranger to the pool. This was where he had first seen Alida, and he had often returned since then to pick the fruit, hoping to see her again. He told her about himself to make her feel at home. He confessed with honesty and frankness that he was a member of the dreaded Carib tribe that had so often attacked the island of Barancan. As a young boy, He had been left behind after one of those raids, and he had stayed on the island ever since. Alida listened closely to his story, and the two became friends. They met again in the days that followed, and their friendship grew stronger. Alida admired the young man's courage in living among his enemies. She learned to call him by his Carib name, Taru, and he called her Alida, just as her own people did. Before long, their friendship had turned into love. Their meetings by the pool were always brief. Alida was afraid their secret might be discovered, and careful though she was, there came a day when someone saw them and told her father. Alida was forbidden to visit the Pomarosa pool, and to put an end to her romance with the stranger, her father decided to marry her to a man of his own choosing. Preparations for the wedding started at once. Alida was torn with grief, and one evening she cried out to her God, "Oh, Yukayu, help me. Kill me or do what you will with me, but do not let me marry this man whom I do not love." And the great god Yukayu took pity on her and changed her into a delicate red flower. Meanwhile, Taru, knowing nothing of Alida's sorrow, still waited for her by the Pomarosa pool. Day after day he waited. Sometimes he stayed there until a mantle of stars was spread across the sky. One night the moon took pity on him. "Taru," she called from her place high above the stars. "Oh, Taru, wait no longer for Alida. Your secret was made known, and Alida was to be married to a man of her father's choosing." In her grief she called to her god Yukayu. He heard her plea for help and changed her into a red flower. "Ahi, ahi," cried Taru. "Oh, moon, what is the name of the red flower?" "Only Yukayu knows that," the moon replied. Then Taru called out, "Oh, Yukayu, god of my Alida, help me too. Help me to find her." And just as the great god had heard Alida's plea, he listened now to Taru and decided to help him. There, by the Pomarosa pool, before the moon and the silent stars, the great god changed Taru into a small, many-colored bird. "Fly, Colibri, and find your love among the flowers," he said. Off went the Colibri, flying swiftly, and as he flew his wings made a sweet humming sound. In the morning, the Indians saw a new bird darting around among the flowers, swift as an arrow and brilliant as a jewel. They heard the humming of its wings, and in amazement they saw it hover in the air over every blossom, kissing the petals of the flowers with its long, slender bill. They liked the new bird with the music in its wings, and they called it Hummingbird. Ever since then, the little many-colored bird has hovered over every flower he finds, but returns most often to the flowers that are red. He is still looking, always looking, for the one red flower that will be his lost Alida. He has not found her yet. That's the story.
Oh, these do remind me of the indigenous tales. And the god you were talking about is a Taino god, which is of the gods of the Puerto Rican indigenous peoples. Uh-huh. I have a feeling if we were able to dig more into her ancestral understand, she is probably a part of that indigenous group, because they're from her area as well. Like they are from that area. So I absolutely believe these are tales from her community.
Yeah.
Which is gorgeous. And I love that she was able to preserve that and share that, because that's what we know when it comes to like indigenous and like especially older religious groups is the stories of creation, of love and creation.
Yeah.
It is so beautiful. And I love that she preserved that so we could hear these stories.
I know. And I want to find so many more of them. And I guess I have to wait for the Internet Archive to be unhacked, or I need to I found some used versions of the books, but they were you know how Amazon automatically...
the eBay level of
Yeah, they're price jacked up to $250 or whatever, you know?
Right.
And yeah, no, I find it fascinating, and I find it fascinating that they're out of print, and you know, I hope someone does something about that. But
right,
especially because I love reading the earliest versions of folktales I can find, but usually that means reading white interpretations of folktales, and so reading not that but the oldest that I can find is for me the sweet spot, you know?
Right. And on top of that, someone who heard it from an area that she knew, was familiar with, that was her home.
Yeah.
One of the best parts to this is learning about indigenous people that I didn't know anything about. I know nothing about Yukuyu and that god in itself, and which we love on our show. We love doing like mythical goddesses and creatures and all of those because, there's so much power behind that and the reason people believe in them. But not knowing that obviously Puerto Rico, it makes sense to know there's an indigenous group there and community there that needs to be preserved, and their history should be preserved and deserve to be preserved. Probably should be in power, whatnot. But all of that to say is now, like, you brought this understanding through the talks of a library. I love the connectedness of it.
I know, and I love that it's like the work that she did about keeping this stuff alive, and then like obviously language is an important part of. I mean, obviously Spanish isn't the indigenous language, but compared to English for an immigrant community, it's like really important to have stuff
for her specifically.
Yeah, and just like making the library a space that's actually for the communities as part of. I was really impressed by her story, and and it's a lot of stuff that I take for granted. Like even the story about the origin of libraries, I had just been like, oh yeah, of course a country has to have roads, a country has to have public lending libraries, otherwise it's not really a country, is it? And it's like, well, actually, we're pretty new to having them.
Like, it's also a story about understanding how important that history is and librarians are and what they bring to a community, as we're in one of the worst states for librarians and libraries and banned books. And a reminder of like how important these stories are that so many cannot understand. Because culturally, we should be able to learn about these things, and people should know about these groups of people who have always existed before them, for us. So all of that is beautiful, as well as the fact that, I love things like the little libraries, that
totally.
You see the like birdhouse looking libraries, but in order to like kind of take back control from those who are trying to ban books and trying to like make libraries the enemies somehow. When stories like these are so important, and then people like her brought traditions and tales, folklore to life to children who didn't understand, or maybe for a long time, especially when, as a person who immigrated to the U.S., was taught to learn U.S. culture and white culture, essentially, to truly understand the country if you want to be a citizen, instead of understanding that their culture was just as important to the makeup of this area, specifically New Yorkers who are from Puerto Rico, and children who may have been born in New York, but their families are from Puerto Rico, and then being able to learn about their culture and to appreciate their own culture. Like, wow, she did so much at such an early time. Like, obviously, I'm very excited. You opened up this big box, and I'm like, oh my God, I love everything about this, including the libraries.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's just like, I want to fly on the wall that stuff so bad, like,
so good.
And even it ties into what you're saying just now, ties into how one of the problems with the early libraries, including, some of the women's ones and the free black ones and stuff, is they fell into this idea that like, this is for the improvement of people by reading philosophy and stuff. And I'll read some philosophy here and there, right? I get it. I think that stuff matters, but this idea that fiction is distinct as this like lesser thing is something that we're finally starting to break away from. And I think part of the way that we break away from it is exactly what you're talking about how these stories and this idea of culture, like stories are how you preserve culture in a lot of ways. And so like stories matter, fiction matters just as much, Yeah. And I just think libraries are cool. I've already spoken at 2 so far on this tour, and like I can't wait to speak at more of them. And
yeah, one of my favorite things, again, like I will continue to go to the different cities or to different places and find libraries. Went to New York, and we went to the library immediately. Like we explored everything. But thank you. I was going to say two things. One, I love that story. I love being able to hear her writing, because it's exactly what I had. When you thirst for a cultural like folklore, that is exactly what I would like to hear. Like that was perfectly done, and you telling it was so perfectly like
thanks.
Obviously Margaret is a writer. She's definitely a storyteller. Here it is. And like being able to hear it through you, both of those were chef's kiss. So thank you for sharing with me.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks for coming on to my episode about libraries. There's going to be more of them. And if people want to hear more stories about stuff that their mom never told them and then accidentally ask really personal questions that
Traumatic.
you don't intend to ask, where can they do that?
Well, we do talk a lot about our trauma. As in fact, I started Stuff Mom Never Told You by talking about the Me Too movement and the trauma.
Yeah.
So there you go. But that's Stuff Mom Never Told You. You can listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast. We have 12 years worth of episodes.
That's amazing.
So if you want to go listen to all the different hosts that's been there, the historical context, you want to hear our reactions to like different elections, which is really still stings a little bit, you can do that as well. We also have a book, and it's called Stuff Mom Never Told You, actually at libraries. We were able to find them at the Seattle Library and the New York Library.
Cool.
Boston, no, we hadn't written the book yet. So if you want to go check it out at the library, it's there.
Yeah, and if it's not, you should request it.
Yeah, please. Also, you can find me on McVey Sam Instagram for my doggy pictures.
That is what Instagram is for, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Well, if you want to find me on tour, you can look at my Instagram or my Substack, and I will be posting tour dates. And if you don't live in the U.S., you can tell me that you could be like, why aren't you coming to where I live? And then the answer is the aforementioned dog. And on some level, I'm aware that I could probably find someone to watch my dog for long enough to go to a different country. But why would I want to? I like my dog more than I like you, dear listener. And that's not even a slight against you. It's just how much I like my dog. But that's unrelated. And also, I have a book out called The Sapling Cage. It's what I'm on tour about. And you should go read it. It is fiction. I have a bunch of other books too, including the most entertainingly titled is Escape from Incel Island. So you can go read that if you want. And you could also listen to Cooler Zone Media, because nothing would be funnier than watching me complain about ads and then there's no ads. And wouldn't that be funny? And also you can listen to all the Cool Zone Media podcasts that way, including an awful lot of shows, including, there was one I really liked recently. Oh, there was a really good It Could Happen Here about the future of coffee done by Prop, who does Hood Politics with Prop. Mm-hmm. And it is like one of the best encapsulations of climate crisis and also how capitalism and extractive practices work, and also how cooperativism, it was just like, I don't even drink coffee.
It's also super funny.
Yeah. I've been long holding that Prop is my favorite explain current events person in my life.
He starts off the episode by just singing a song and
totally.
So get past that part.
Yeah.
That always throws me off. When hosts start singing or rapping, I'm like, what's happening? I'm never prepared.
Yeah, but he's like a professional rapper.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure it's good. It's still shocking, though, to see it live. Like, if I'm on mic or somebody.
Yeah.
But I love them.
But stay for the vibes. Stay for the vibes.
And that's it. We're here at the end of the show.
Bye.
Bye.
Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff is a production of Cool Zone Media. For more podcasts from Cool Zone Media, visit our website, coolzonemedia.com, or check us out on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Shout out to the team at Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff for putting this together, letting us run it, having Samantha on.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a fantastic podcast. Really great history of revolutionaries who've done incredible things. And I love everything that Margaret does. We need to have her back on the show because she's actually written several books. So we should definitely have her back on for her news book too, because it's, from what I understand, really good.
Yes. Yes, we should. Well, in the meantime, listeners, if you would like to contact us, you can. You can email us at stephanieandmomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff Mom Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a T Public store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And listeners, thanks to you for listening. Stuff Mom Never Told You is a podcast from iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your favorite shows.